The history of economic thinking is a concern with many philosophers and ideas in the topic that evolved into political economy and later economics, from antiquity to the present days. In the field of economics, it comprises a wide range of various schools of thinking in economics. The history of economics thinking is a concern with the origins and evolution of economic ideas as well as their interrelationship and interdependence. It provides an account of the development of economic concept throughout history. Despite the fact of economic history and the history of economic thoughts are two distinct fields of study, they are strongly tied to one another. An economic concept are influenced by the economic condition and surroundings of a country, either directly or indirectly. Ideas and their surrounding environment are extremely significant, as seen by intimate link between the history of economic thoughts and the history of economic history. There are several different modern definitions of a term's economic. Some of discrepancy may due to a shifting perspective on the topic matter itself or divergent viewpoints among economists. Even 100 years after the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, stress economic and social problems remain unsolved in many parts of the world. Many people suffer as a result of business fluctuation. Individuals could no longer rely solely on their own initiative and abilities to overcome circumstances that were thrust upon them. There were difficulties for farmers and farm laborers, and many of them drifted into urban areas, attracted by the current of a better opportunity and driven by the cloud of rural poverty. In the year before adequate workers' compensation laws were enacted, industrial accidents frequently result in serious hardship for workers and their families. This economic harnesses what appeared to be Olympian objectivity and come to the conclusion that, while the classical economists' value and distribution theories were incorrect, their policy view were true. Early marginalists believed that classical value and distribution theories made a mistake in concluding that land rent is an earned income and the exchange value is determined by the amount of labor time spent in the production process, and that were they wrong. If classical economy could be pursued to stress something that its inventor never meant, namely that rent is immoral and that labor is the source of a value, then the discipline of economy was long overdue for a full revision.
10 major tenets. First, focus on the margin. The school focused its attention on the point of change where decisions are made, in other words, on the margin. The marginalist extend to all economic theory the marginalist principle that Ricardo developed in his theory of rent. Secondly, rational economic behavior. The marginalists assume that people act rationally in balancing pleasure and pain, in measuring the marginal utilities of different goods, and balancing present against future need. They also assume that purposeful behavior is normal and typical, and that random abnormalities will cancel each other out. The approach employed by the marginalists had its roots in the work of Jeremy Bentham, in that they assume the dominant drive of human action is to seek utility and avoid disutility. Microeconomic emphasis. The individual person or firm takes center stage in the marginalist drama. Instead of considering the aggregate economy or macroeconomy, the marginalists consider individual decision-making, market conditions for a single type of good, the output of specific firm, and so on. The use of the abstract and deductive method. Marginalists rejected the individual method in the favor of analytical, abstract approach by Ricardo and other classicists. Ricardo began with his basic premise and then used logic to deduct generalization. His tendency is to use restrictive assumptions to bolster his argument. The method of partial equilibrium analysis, supported by many members of the marginalist school, was useful for abstracting from the complexity of the real world in order to better understand it. Partial equilibrium is a condition of economic equilibrium which takes into consideration only one variable to change ceteris paribus. To attain equilibrium, this enables the investigator to analyze the complex phenomenon or not one step at a time. The pure competition emphasis. The marginalists normally, based on their analysis on the assumption of pure competition, they are individuals who are individualistic, independent, entrepreneur, diverse, buyer and seller, homogeneous product and no advertising. No one person or firm has enough economic power to influence market price perceptibly. Individuals can adapt their own action to demand, supply, and price as worked out in the market through the interaction of thousands of people. Demand-oriented price theory. Demand became the primary force in the price determination for the early marginalists. The classical economists emphasized production cost as the significant determination of exchange value. Emphasis on subjective utility. According to the marginalists, demand depends on marginal utility, which is a subjective physiological phenomenon. Cost of the production include the sacrifice of examiners of working, managing a business, and saving money to form a capital fund. Equilibrium approach. The marginalists believe that the economic force generally tend toward equilibrium, which is balancing of opposing force. Whenever disturbance causes discoloration, new movement toward equilibrium occur. Measure of land with capital good. The marginalists lump and capital research together in their analysis and spoke of the interest, rent, and profit as being the return to property research. This has advantage analytically and also combat the conclusion drawn by some that land rent is unearned income and unnecessarily payment in order to ensure the use of land. Marginalists generally couple the reward to the landowner with interest theory. Minimal government involvement. The marginalists continue the classical school defense of minimal government involvement in the economy as the most desirable policy. In most cases, no interference with natural economic law was in order if maximum social benefit were to be realized.
For whom did marginalists could benefit or seek of benefit? In general, marginalists could benefit merchant capitalists, king and government officials of benefits the powerful who have monopoly power. The economic rent imposed on merchant capitalists was one way for the private sector to increase their profit by obtaining more favorable regulation. The laws mentioned are in the form of rating status, prohibition on imports, monopolies, and regulation to make it difficult for producers and new traders to compete with existing traders. The methods provides enlightenment to government officials where they regard the matter as a royalty to their service as government officials. In terms of import cases, England import then printed cotton or printed calico to replace wool known as colicos. Although the use of such goods was prohibited, in 1721 the production and export of printed calico was still allowed by the country of manufacture. From 1686 to 1759, the production, imports, and use of printed cotton or printed calico was banned in France. In 1666 to 1730, the rules established by France on textile had 7 large volumes, while manuals or guidance on dyeing it was estimated to have 317 articles, which can be said to be the best set of rules for dyeing technique. However, this gives the disadvantages that the existing regulation have hindered the growth and development of new technique by manufacturing firms to compete with existing firms as well as prevented the use of low-cost production technique. The King of France also reached profit from concession fees and monopoly privileges sold to stockholders in the business. Government officials impose a percentage of fines on anyone who breaks the rules in the government. There are also profits derived from the inflow of gold and silver, which further increase the revenue of tax collection. On the goods, proceeds from those profits are also used to improve the country.
How was the marginalist school valid, useful, or correct in its time? The marginalist school developed new and powerful tools of analysis, especially geometric diagrams and mathematical techniques. Conditions of demands were given rightful importance as one set of determinants for price of both final goods and factor of production. The school emphasized the force that shaped individual decision. This was valid in a world where such decision was significant in determining the course of economic activities. The marginalists explicitly state fundamental assumptions underlying economic analysis. The methodological controversies that the marginalists aroused resulted in a separation of objective and verifiable principle. The method of partial equilibrium analysis, championed by many members of this school, was useful for abstracting from the complexity of the real world the problems of the immensely complicated society with its countless variables was thereby simplified and penetrated in an orderly and systematic manner. The microeconomic approach of marginalism complements the macroeconomic approach, which may overlook many problems by viewing the economy as a whole. As example, first, certain group of people may become increasingly impoverished, although average real per capita income for the nation may be rising. Second, the business cycle is of prime importance to the profitability of a large automobile company, but to the owner of a convenience grocery stores, the business cycle is relatively less important than the opening of a competing store down the street. And the lastly is aggregate analysis tells us that investment in some forms of human capital.
Which tenets of the marginalist school became lasting contribution? Several tenets of the marginalist school were subsequently challenged, and some were rejected. Many of the marginalist theories remain relatively unscathed and attested to by the fact that they can be found in contemporary textbooks on principles of economics and microeconomics. Counties and shares the international field with socialism. Keynes pointed to the alleged fallacy of composition associated with marginalist and neoclassical employment theory. Pure competition can be found in only a few sectors of the economy. The marginalist view that the best government is the one that interferes the least became outdated as new events transpired and new economic theories developed. There were few attempts at inductive verification of theories. In fact, hypotheses often were framed in ways that preclude testing. Business cycles were generally ignored in the firm conviction that supply creates its own demand and therefore that full employment is the rule. William Stanley Jevons. In 1866, he was elected professor of logic and mental and moral philosophy and Cobden professor of political economy at Owens College. William Stanley Jevons, 1835 to 1882, was an economist and philosopher. WHO foreshadowed several developments of the 20th century. Jevons of the main contributors to the marginal revolution, which revolutionized economic theory and shifted classical to neoclassical economics. He was the first economist to construct index numbers, and he had a tremendous influence on the development of empirical methods and the use of statistics and econometrics in the social sciences.
His textbooks on logic were widely used in class and reprinted many times.
Like other logicians, Sir Gibbons began his investigation by studying of nature of the law of thought. In his agreement, he said it is impossible to prove the basic law of logic by reasoning because it is already assumed by the nation of evidence. Thus, the law of thought must assume by science to be initial condition of all thought and all knowledge. Therefore, we must assume that the law of thought as an objective to distinguish between right or wrong reasoning.
Another key addition to modern economics was made by Jevons through his theory of capital. The fact that capital is fundamentally time and the method of expanding the period of investment was highlighted by him as the one of the first point to emphasize. Beginning with the assumption of perfect forces, he proceeded to include the assumptions of preference for present consumptions and perfect competition in his calculation in order to demonstrate the rate of the interest is equal to the marginal productivity of expanding the period of production. He used this as his starting point. Jovin made the critical distinctions between free and invested capital, emphasizing the fact that the border between the two far from being precise and strict in its applications. Indeed, his writing on this issue contained the majority of the core idea contemporary capital theory, which can be found throughout his body of work.
Moreover, one of the significant ideas or theory by Sir Jevon is the theory of diminishing marginal utility. The theory of diminishing marginal utility is one that occurs as a result of declining value of an asset in comparison with other assets. It incorporates a new unit of that good and is known by the name of marginal utility. We can see the graph of theory of diminishing marginal utility, which show that as more goods are consumed, the marginal utility decreases. This theory is applied more in capitalist society where the accumulation of goods are common element. Also, it allows identify marginal utilities that diminish with the passage of time, forming utility curve with negative slope.
Statistical Science and Sunspot Theory of Economic Cycle by William Stanley Gibbon. Gibbon believed that economics used the same inductive method as the physical science. Probability was the necessary basis for the judgment in the science because certainty was unattainable. Therefore, Gibbon's conception of probability and of its role in science was expounded in his book, The Principles of Science. The Principles was almost wholly concerned with the physical science and questioned the roles of probability in the analysis of social data. His inspirations of statistics carried him to the most ridiculous idea of his life, the explanations of commercial crises on basis of the periodic alternations of spots on the sun. In the solar period and the price of corn, 1875, Gibbon analyzed price data on 7 types of grain in search of 11-year cycle. He also calculated from means for each commodity and aggregate price the fluctuation in which was of so very considerable an amount, and so well marked in form, that it might be deemed quite conclusive. He analyzed the data from another point of view, considering the distributions of the years of maximums and minimum prices through the 11 years of cycle.
In conclusion, the story of marginalist school goes back to 1871, when William Stanley Jevon and Carl Major published their seminal work on the theory of marginal utility. The marginalist school opposed socialist ideology and government intervention in the economy. Instead, they re-emphasized the use of laissez-faire system pioneered by the classical school. In general, the school seeks to advance the interests of all humanity by promoting a better understanding of how market systems efficiently allocate resources and promote economic freedom. The marginalist analysis applies to the whole body of microeconomics. The new age of purely economy thought, neoclassical economics from the 1870, produced a complete and a coherent new macroeconomic theory. Therefore, marginal economy is only a short period between the classical and neoclassical school.